Celtics take game one of the NBA Finals. Let's run through a few different things and also a couple thoughts on Danny Hurley potentially becoming the Lakers head coach before we get to Raja. So this game got to 58-29. Celtics doubling up the Mavs. And I always expect every team to make a run if you're remotely decent, that you're going to cut the lead. And Dallas closed really well at the end of the first half, but the three-point shooting wasn't there. Boston was dominating on the boards. And then you went into the third quarter wondering, will the Celtics put this thing away in the first 4 minutes? They've been terrific. Some of the defensive stuff that I want to get to here, and that was not the case. Luka continues to go off on one-on-one offensive plays. They did not have the same flow that they had against Minnesota. There's a lot of defensive stuff that I love from Boston last night, but the offensive part of it, and Tatum struggles throughout much of the game despite the final numbers, you were like, wait, this thing's gone from 29 points to 8 points. Again, I expect teams to make a run. It's not sustainable to stay up 30 points the entire game. It just isn't, especially with the shooting variance that you're going to have from Boston throughout multiple moments. But for anyone that's watched Boston this year, you're going, uh-oh, is this going to be the stale part? Because it is stale right now on offense. How long is the stale part going to last? Well, it lasted until about 4:27 of that third quarter, where it was cut to 8. And Jaylen Brown, you've probably seen the quote everywhere, but I thought it was perfect for him and the game he played last night, where he said, quote, when they cut the lead to 8, that's when the game started. This was the Jaylen Brown game. He was fantastic. It's not just 22 points. It's him understanding. One of my favorite things I saw from him last night, like this is one of my favorite Jaylen Brown games ever, considering the stakes and everything going on, where it was attack, attack, attack. Whether it was attacking on defense, but specifically some of the stuff that he did on offense, where it's not like he went for 40 here. He didn't even go for 30. But when we look at some 30-point games of players, you're like, oh, that guy had 30. Like that was kind of a quiet 30. I thought it was an incredibly loud 22. And then you have the defense. There was a stretch there where it felt like he was doing everything and being the aggressor on offense. But then a little later in the quarter, there's a lob attempt that he blocks. And then the Mavs player regains control of the basketball. He blocks that again. And then he gets Kyrie with another block on the baseline. And you're like, this guy is taking over on top of the stuff that he was tasked with by being the primary defender on Luka, where you know Luka's going to end up going up against a bunch of different people, considering all the pick and roll stuff that they're going to do. But Jaylen was doing some early work here defensively just to make it harder on Luka. And if that continues to be the game plan, we'll see how Luka holds up against it, because Luka's still going to get his points, but it's the difference. It's kind of like the Lou Dort versus Minnesota thing. Is the 30 really tough? Well, against Lou Dort, I think there were times where it was really tough for Luka to get his numbers. And against Minnesota, I thought there were times it was just way too easy. So Jaylen Brown ends up with 22, 6, and 2. But again, like I said, it was a loud stat line for him, just understanding some of those moments during that staleness of I need to step up my aggression here, because Tatum didn't have it. Tatum ended up with 16 points. He was 6 of 16. The 6 turnovers were brutal. He just was uncomfortable. He had 11 boards. He had some assists. He is pretty good on the drive and kick stuff of keeping some of the plays alive. And with the three-point shooting, with him collapsing the paint, there's still a benefit to him driving. But I'll look for it in game 2, because it was definitely part of the game plan for Dallas. It seems like on Tatum drives, he is facing all sorts of traffic once he gets into the rim. So there's times Tatum could probably just say, hey, I need to go up and at least make the shot attempt. And I know there's a couple times. Look, anybody who has the ball as much as Tatum's going to have a few drives where they feel like they should have been at the free throw line. But I'm not going to use the officials here for an excuse to Tatum. He just had a bad game, and the turnovers were part of it. I wouldn't expect him to play like this for an entire series. Porzingis was the story early on. Lit it up in the first half. Checks in. Hadn't played in 38 days. You kind of wondered, can you just go out there and play game 1 of the finals, play that kind of intensity, and be a real impact? And he was all of that. It was almost like the Celtics from that first half added a top 5 player in the NBA. Like, oh, yeah. Like, that's how well he played. Because it wasn't just the offense. He had 11 points, 2 blocks, 3 rebounds in the last 5:24 of the first quarter, hit 5 of 4 of his shots. But he also was getting into some of those switches where some of the stuff that he can do, it looks like everybody's just kind of waiting around to figure out if he's going to take a shot over the smaller defender. But at 7'3", it just is a great look for him, especially with his shooting touch. And he was hitting all of that stuff. He had a couple threes, but I think the defensive stuff that he was doing was just as impressive. I'll get to some of the lack of lobs here in a second. But for Porzingis, when you watch him, when he retreats against a drive, he's retreating playing the contest. He doesn't want to come up and stop your drive. He's almost inviting you to drive in. Jaden Hardy had a drive against him because Hardy just is not as athletic as he is, as impressive as he's been in some of these big moments in the playoffs, and he's Mr. Garbage Time. I can't even believe he passed the basketball when he came in, and the Mavs waved the white flag at like 5:17, which Boston was pretty much in control of this game other than when Luka kind of went off there in the third quarter and cut it to 8. But Hardy comes in, shots are just going up. They're going up. But Hardy didn't understand Porzingis' capabilities defensively. So Hardy's thinking with his athleticism, like, I'm just going to go right at this guy and kind of turn. And Porzingis is backpedaling, arms up, sizing it up the whole time, like welcoming you into that attempt. And somebody like Kyrie that's more refined and understands the opponent probably a lot better than Jaden Hardy ever does. And of course, Luka, who I still think, oddly, because you're just so used to him playing almost perfect basketball. Luka, I thought, was those late finds legs and I were talking about a couple weeks ago and how impressive they are, these deep drives. You're like, is he going to go up? It's like, wait, he just turned his body like 270 degrees and then threw it out to somebody. And granted, when you're stationed outside on the perimeter, some of the passes, I don't want to say like they're not as impressive, but it's not as if Luka doesn't understand where everybody's supposed to be around him, but that he can find them so late on the drive. And you think there's no way he's actually going to pass out of this movement. He has to get the shot up. There are a few more times, I think, than I've seen in an entire game where Luka looked like he was held up. So I don't know if that's part of the Porzingis thing as well. But his defense, the way you think you have him and you don't, adds a completely different layer to this Boston defense. So let's look at some of the stats. The Mavs had 0 assists in the third quarter. So they're making this run. And I don't care who you are. And maybe it feels like it's a little different with Boston because they're so 3-point heavy that when they're stale offensively, which every team has stretches in any game for the most part, where you're like, oh, what's going on with their offense? There's not as much movement. I mean, this is just basketball. It's what happens. I know it's frustrating at home on the couch when it's happening to your team, but I've heard people complain about it as if it's a decision that is made. Hey, let's just be real stale. But also, I think when you get up 29, 58-29, you're not going to be playing with the same kind of passion. And that's why basketball coaches are the most insane human beings ever, because they're seeing it as well, going, why did we stop playing? It's like, man, it's human nature. You're never going to defeat human nature inside of a basketball game. So the Mavs are putting together this run, but they're putting together with absurd, like this stretch of one-on-one play where you're like, okay, so there's a couple different factors here. And then the Jaylen Brown stuff happens on offense and on defense, and they run away with this one. The Mavs had 9 total assists in this game. That's the lowest total for a team in an NBA Finals game since Cleveland had 9 in Game 1 of the 2007 NBA Finals. Kyrie had 2, Luka had 1. The doubles are not happening the way Dallas lived off of them against other opponents. So even the times when Luka's going to beat whoever the primary defender is, he's going to bring Derek White down. He's going to get Drew Holiday deep. He's going to get Jaylen on a misstep. He's just going to get to his spots. But that there wasn't this reckless scrambling by Boston defensively. Like, they liked how they played it straight up. That part is alarming because it took away from Dallas the assist plays. It took away the corner 3 attempts. Dallas had 3 attempts from the corners for the entire game. Josh Green's the only one that made one, and that was the late one off of a Hardy pass, which, again, I still can't believe Hardy made that pass, because when he gets in, shots are going up. Lobs. We know that part of Dallas has been unstoppable. It wasn't even noticeable last night. It was only noticeable that it wasn't happening. Was there one good one and then maybe one other kind of weird one that happened? I don't know what the final official lob count is, but it was not a part of Dallas's offense. So you have Kyrie, who doesn't have a great game, goes 6 of 19. And I went back through it. I don't know if we touched on this with Bill, but I was wondering, hey, could I find something in here where if the crowd really gets on Kyrie, will Kyrie start talking back to them? Can that take him off of his game a little bit? I do think Kyrie in past playoff games has had moments where he feels like I'm just going to do something here, and it can be a little bit on his own. It can be outside of what they're trying to do, and he's so capable of doing pretty much anything with the basketball that you would almost allow it. But I know that I've seen moments with him where I go, I think he's just doing this now because he wants to do it. So I wondered, is there any history here with his games at Boston that shows that it's below the normal Kyrie standards? It isn't. He's had some monster games in that place after he's left Boston. He's had 2 39-point games. I think both were in the playoffs. So maybe one was in the regular season. The point is there was nothing there. There's no evidence there. So you can't go in, first game in Boston. And he had even said, and I think Boston was just so amped up in general that they weren't going to – that crowd was unbelievable at the start of that game. My God. But I don't think it was just because of the Kyrie. It was almost like the Celtics fans were like, oh, wait, Kyrie now has the ball. Like, let's make sure we boo him again. And it didn't seem as targeted as maybe one would expect. So I think Kyrie just had a bad shooting night, which is going to happen to literally everybody here. So when you think about the lack of the lobs, the corner threes, like, okay, so what else is happening here? Boston attacked Luka more in switches, I think, earlier in the game when they were trying to establish some of the stuff that they wanted to do. Maybe they got away from it just because it didn't seem to be as much of a priority in the second half. I'd have to go back and look at some of that stuff, but the game wasn't logged this morning for the way that I can watch it again in the morning. So I didn't have that for you. I apologize. But I couldn't help but thinking about Minnesota a few different times in last night's game because Minnesota didn't attack Luka nearly enough. And you could talk about the defensive assignments and the alignment, and Luka being the low man, and maybe them not wanting to go through that, but it just didn't feel like that was a priority. And one of the things that you always thought with Dallas is like they're putting together this incredible defensive run as they close the regular season and the stuff that they're doing in the playoffs. But if it's Kyrie and Luka out there, we can talk about the effort and the improvement from Kyrie of just being locked in off the ball more now than he has been in the past. But can't you still win some of these one-on-one matchups against these players that we know are average at best on defense? And I think Boston did a better job of that. So I don't know if that combined with Jaylen Brown picking him up around half court and trying to slow him down and getting into whatever he wants to get into leads to a more tired Luka at the end of the game. It's kind of like running the football. We may not get 5 yards on every one of these carries in the first quarter, but we need to throw these body blows. So I feel like that's the body blow of this matchup by trying to get Luka more involved defensively. The other part where I thought about Minnesota is here you have Gobert in Towns, who was really good against Jokic because it's more in front of him. It's more stationary. He doesn't have to react athletically as much against Jokic, but Jokic is still going to get his stuff going, right? But I thought he at least fought in that matchup better, despite the stupid fouls, than he would in, say, a different kind of matchup. But then you have Gobert off of Gordon, and yet it felt like Minnesota was helpless against the lobs, whereas Boston with Porzingis was just a lot better, or because they didn't double as much, the lob just wasn't as available, which again seems crazy that, wait, Boston doesn't have to double as much, but yet Minnesota with all these perimeter defensive options, it's not that I don't think they were doubling Luka a lot. It just Luka worked them on the first move, and then he just kind of dictated everything once he had Jaden McDaniels on his hip. Sam Hauser attacks 0 for 3, and I thought the fourth one was a tough foul call on him. Sam Hauser gets into the game. Let's go at Sam Hauser. And guess what happens? Hauser holds up, stays in position. Doesn't mean no one can hit a shot against him, but it's just always funny to watch. And you think, okay, we're in the NBA Finals. You've done all of this prep, whatever. But Hauser still is probably the best option depending on who else he's out there with. You can see Pritchard where it looked like, okay, Pritchard's out there. Let's try to target him. You saw Luka get some of those matchups a few different times. So I wonder how many minutes Pritchard will play moving forward. If there's a close game, I don't know if Boston's going to want to attempt to see him out there defensively and exposing him a little bit because it looked like Dallas noticed it immediately. There's one play here that I absolutely love because Horford's going to be targeted a lot. But Horford was doing an incredible job on contesting Luka on these threes once he got stuck with him on the switch. There was a timeout in the second quarter. They decided to come in, aligning it where the ball's on the right side, but they want Luka on the left side and they want him off the ball. And they're going to run him through the paint from the left side for a catch on the right side, hoping to either get a switch on a smaller player so he can get a really deep catch. And at that point, it doesn't matter if it's Drew and certainly not Derek White. If Luka is deep and positioned with the basketball, those guys are going to be in trouble despite Drew's stoutness. It's just not enough. Horford sees it, switches it, and then you're thinking maybe if Luka on this play gets Horford in a switch, you're like, cool, now we have Luka on the weak side because I think they had stationed the other three on the other side, and now he can go to work on Horford, and it's not straight in the middle of the paint. Some of that side-to-side stuff you'll hear coaches talk about all the time, like we need to get side-to-side. We need to get this ball. We can't just go straight into it every single time. And so there's the two options they're hoping where Luka gets a deep catch against a smaller defender, or he's got Al weak side and it's one-on-one away from the rest of the traffic. And Horford reads it perfectly and still almost steals the pass to Luka. Like that's one of those plays you're like, man, these guys are absolutely locked in. It's game one. I doubt Dallas is going to have that bad a night from the corner, but the doubles are not there. And the random times they did send a second defender at Luka, it was kind of late and it was like more disruptive, or it was something that was happening at the rim where Luka had the ridiculous shot where he made it against four guys. There's always different things you can pick from. Say, well, Dallas is going to shoot that poorly from three. Yep. You could also say Tatum's probably not going to have that bad of a game moving forward. Porzingis isn't going to be Will Chamberlain for the entire first half, but Dallas has got to figure out. I'm not going to overreact to the first game and say, okay, there's just no chance. There's just no chance because I just have too much respect for Luka on that one.